At my son's luxury wedding, I was made to sit alone in the back. Your poverty will embarrass us, his bride sneered. Suddenly, a man in an expensive suit sat next to me. Act like you're with me. When my son saw us together, he turned pale. Can you even imagine being told on your son's wedding day that your poverty would embarrass us, and then being shoved into the very back row like some shameful secret? That was my reality. But right there, amidst the humiliation, a mysterious, impeccably dressed stranger sat beside me, whispered, "Act like you're with me." And when my son saw us together, his face went white. What happened next wasn't just a wedding, it was a reckoning. My champagne glass trembled in my hand. Not from excitement, but from a bone-deep ache of humiliation. The wedding coordinator, a woman with a smile as thin as her perfect manicure, had just pointed to the very back row. Your poverty will embarrass us, Vivian, my son's bride, had sneered hours earlier, her words sharp. And my own son, Brandon, just nodded. He avoided my eyes, like I was some shameful family secret he hoped would disappear. Honestly, at least they were consistent in their cruelty. My name is Eleanor Patterson, and I'm 68 years old. 3 years ago, I buried my husband, Robert, after a grueling battle with cancer. I thought that was the worst pain life could throw at me. I was wrong. Nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for the systematic humiliation my son and his entitled fiancée would put me through, culminating in this moment at his wedding to Denver's most arrogant socialite. The Ashworth estate sprawled before me, looking like something ripped straight from a movie set. Manicured gardens, marble fountains, and 500 guests mingling in designer clothes that probably cost more than my entire monthly pension. I smoothed down my navy blue dress, the nicest one I owned, and tried to remind myself that I had every right to be here. This was my son's wedding, even if he seemed to have completely forgotten that tiny detail. Eleanor Patterson. The coordinator's voice was dripping with barely concealed disdain, like I was a particularly unpleasant stain on the pristine seating chart. Row 12, seat 15. The very back. Naturally. Behind the florist. Behind the photographers. Practically in the parking lot. I could see Vivian's mother, Catherine Ashworth, at the front, surrounded by her society friends, all of them stealing glances at me like I was some bizarre curiosity in a zoo. As I made my way down the aisle, conversations quieted. Not a respectful hush for the mother of the groom, no. More like the uncomfortable silence of people witnessing something awkward, something beneath them. I overheard a woman in a $1,000 hat whisper to her companion, "That's Brandon's mother." Vivian told me she used to clean houses. I didn't clean houses. I taught high school English for 37 years. But that didn't fit their carefully crafted narrative, did it? The back row was mostly empty, just a few late arrivals and what looked like catering staff. I settled into my assigned seat, my heart a heavy stone in my chest, watching my son greet guests at the altar. He looked so handsome in his tailored tuxedo, every inch the successful lawyer he'd become. For a fleeting moment, I remembered the little boy who used to bring me dandelions, proudly declaring I was the prettiest mommy in the world. That little boy, I realized with a fresh pang, had died somewhere along the way to becoming this man who was so utterly ashamed of where he came from. The ceremony began with all the pomp and circumstance worthy of royalty. Vivian floated down the aisle in a dress that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a year. She was beautiful, I had to admit, in that cold, pristine way that money could buy. As she passed my row, her gaze never even flickered in my direction. Brandon's eyes were fixed on his bride, with an intensity that made my chest ache. He'd never looked at me with that kind of love, not even as a child. I'd always been the practical parent, the one who handled homework and discipline, while Robert was the fun dad, who took him to baseball games. Dearly beloved, the minister began, and I tried to focus, tried to feel grateful to be here at all. After all, they could have simply not invited me. That particular cruelty, I suppose, was apparently beneath even Vivian, though barely. That's when I felt someone sit down beside me. I turned to see a distinguished man in an impeccably tailored charcoal suit, settling into the seat. He had silver hair, sharp blue eyes, and the kind of quiet confidence that money and power bred. Everything about him screamed wealth, from his Italian leather shoes to the elegant watch that caught the afternoon light. "Act like you're with me," he whispered, his voice low and urgent. Before I could even respond, he placed his hand gently over mine and smiled at me as if we were old friends, sharing a lovely afternoon. The transformation was immediate, startling. Suddenly, I wasn't the pathetic woman sitting alone in the back row. I was part of a couple, and clearly a very well-dressed, sophisticated couple at that. The whispering around us took on a different tone entirely. "Who is that man with Brandon's mother?" I heard someone behind us murmur. "He looks important. Maybe we misjudged the situation." My mysterious companion had remarkable timing. Just as Brandon and Vivian were exchanging vows, he leaned closer and whispered, "Your son is about to look this way. When he does, smile at me like I just told you something fascinating." I had no idea who this man was, or why he was helping me, but I found myself following his lead. Sure enough, Brandon's gaze swept across the crowd during a pause in the ceremony and landed directly on our row. When he saw me sitting beside this elegant stranger, laughing softly at whatever he'd apparently just said, Brandon's face went completely, utterly white. Vivian noticed her new husband's distraction and followed his stare. Her perfectly composed expression faltered for just a moment when she saw me. No longer alone and pathetic, but apparently accompanied by someone who looked like he belonged in the front row with the other important guests. The mysterious man squeezed my hand gently. "Perfect," he murmured. "Your son looks like he's seen a ghost." "Who are you?" I whispered back, trying to maintain the appearance of casual conversation. "Someone who should have been in your life a long time ago," he replied cryptically. "We'll talk after the ceremony. For now, just enjoy watching your son try to figure out what's happening." And I have to admit, I was enjoying it immensely. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I had some power in this family dynamic. The confusion and concern on Brandon's face was almost worth the humiliation of being seated in social Siberia. The ceremony continued, but the energy had definitively shifted. People kept glancing back at us, clearly trying to figure out who my companion was and what his presence meant. The society matrons who had been whispering about my inferior status were now craning their necks for a better look at the distinguished gentleman who was treating me with such obvious respect and affection. When the minister pronounced Brandon and Vivian husband and wife, my mysterious ally stood and offered me his arm like a proper gentleman. "Shall we proceed to the reception, my dear Eleanor?" He knew my name. This was getting more interesting by the minute. As we walked toward the reception tent, I could feel eyes following us. The same people who had dismissed me 20 minutes earlier were now regarding me with curiosity and what looked suspiciously like newfound respect. "You never told me your name," I said quietly as we made our way across the manicured lawn. He smiled, an expression that transformed his entire face. "Theodore Blackwood. But you used to call me Theo." The world tilted slightly on its axis. "Tai. Me Tai. From 50 years ago. Theodore Blackwood." The name hit me like a physical blow, carrying with it a flood of memories I'd carefully locked away decades ago. I stopped walking so abruptly that several guests nearly collided with us. "Tai." My voice came out as barely a whisper. "But that's impossible. You're supposed to be in Europe. You're supposed to be married with grandchildren by now." He guided me to a quiet corner of the garden, away from the crowd streaming toward the reception tent. Up close, I could still see the boy I'd loved desperately when I was 18 years old. His eyes were the same startling blue, though now framed by lines that spoke of years I hadn't shared with him. His smile was the same, too, warm and slightly mischievous. "I never married," he said simply, "and I never stopped looking for you." The words hung between us like a bridge across 50 years of separation. I felt 18 again and 68 simultaneously, a dizzying combination that made me grateful for his steadying hand on my arm. "Looking for me?" I managed, a hint of accusation in my voice. "Theo, I got married. I had a son. I built a life. You left for that business program in London and never came back." His expression grew pained. "I wrote you letters, Eleanor. Dozens of them. I called your apartment for months. I even came back to Denver twice during those first 2 years, but you'd moved, and no one would tell me where." He paused, studying my face. "You never got any of my letters, did you?" The pieces of a 50-year-old puzzle began falling into place with sickening clarity. My mother. She had never approved of Theo because his family had money, while ours decidedly did not. My mother, who had always believed I was reaching above my station. My mother, who had been suspiciously supportive when I started dating Robert just months after Theo left for Europe. "She threw them away," I said, the certainty of it settling in my stomach like a stone. "My mother intercepted your letters." "Tausha jotaiten." I suspected as much, but I could never prove it. "When I finally hired a private investigator to find you in 1978, You were already married and pregnant. 1978. Brandon was born in 1979, which meant I'd already been married to Robert for 2 years by then. The timing was cruel in its precision. If Theo had found me just 2 years earlier, if my mother hadn't interfered, if I'd known he was looking for me. You hired a private investigator? The absurdity of it struck me. Here I was, standing in the shadow of my son's wedding reception, discussing roads not taken with the man who had occupied my dreams for the first 5 years of my marriage to Robert. Several, actually, Theo admitted with a rueful smile. It became something of an obsession. Every few years I'd try again. I followed your career, you know. Read about your teaching awards in the local papers. I was proud of you, Eleanor. I always knew you'd touch lives. The reception music started up in the distance. A jazz quartet playing something elegant and expensive. We should join the party, I knew. But I couldn't seem to move from this garden corner where my past and present were colliding in the most spectacular way. Why now? I asked. Why show up today of all days? Theo's expression grew serious. Because I read your husband's obituary 3 years ago. I wanted to reach out then, but it felt inappropriate so soon after your loss. Then last month, I saw the wedding announcement in the society pages. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a newspaper clipping. There it was, the announcement that had filled me with such complicated emotions. A photo of Brandon and Vivian, looking like the golden couple they believed themselves to be. And beneath it, the details of today's celebration at the Ashworth estate. The announcement mentioned that the groom's mother, Eleanor Patterson, was a retired educator. Theo's voice grew soft. I knew it was you immediately. After all these years of searching, I found you in the Denver Post wedding section. The irony was breathtaking. After decades of private investigators and searches, fate had delivered my location through my son's marriage to a woman who had spent the morning making sure I knew how little I belonged in their world. So, you came to crash a wedding? I came to see you, he corrected. I had no intention of interfering with your son's day. I was planning to sit in the back, watch you be proud of your boy, and maybe work up the courage to approach you afterward. His eyes twinkled with mischief. But when I saw how they were treating you, well, I couldn't just sit there and watch. That's when we heard Brandon's voice behind us, sharp with panic and something that might have been anger. Mother, we need to talk now. Brandon approached us with Vivian at his side, both of them looking like they'd just witnessed a natural disaster. My new daughter-in-law's wedding glow had been replaced by an expression of barely controlled panic, while Brandon's face had gone from pale to flushed in the span of our garden conversation. Brandon, I said pleasantly, not releasing Theo's arm. Shouldn't you be greeting your other guests? I'm sure the Ashworths are wondering where the groom has disappeared to. Who is this man? Vivian demanded, her voice pitched just low enough to avoid causing a scene, but sharp enough to draw blood. Her perfect composure was cracking, and it was a beautiful thing to witness. Theo stepped forward with the kind of easy confidence that comes from never having to worry about impressing anyone. Theodore Blackwood, he said, extending his hand to Brandon. I should have introduced myself sooner, but I was caught up in the pleasure of seeing your mother again after so many years. Brandon shook the offered hand automatically, his lawyer's training kicking in even as confusion clouded his features. I'm sorry, Mr. Blackwood, but I don't believe my mother has mentioned you. Hasn't she? Theo's eyebrows rose in mock surprise. How interesting. Eleanor and I have quite a history together, don't we, darling? The casual endearment made Vivian's eyes narrow to slits. I could practically see her mental calculator working, trying to figure out who this man was and what his presence meant for her carefully orchestrated social debut as Brandon's wife. What kind of history? Brandon's voice had taken on the edge it got when he was cross-examining a witness. 20 years of marriage to a trial lawyer had taught me to recognize that tone. Theo's smile never wavered. The kind that matters most. Your mother and I were quite serious once upon a time. Before she met your father, of course. The admission hung in the air like an unexploded bomb. I watched my son process this information, saw the moment when he began to understand that his mother had a life and a past that existed entirely separate from his existence. How serious? Vivian's question came out as more of a hiss. Serious enough that I've spent 50 years regretting the circumstances that separated us, Theo replied, his eyes finding mine. Serious enough that when I saw the wedding announcement and realized Eleanor would be here today, I couldn't stay away. Brandon looked between us with growing alarm. Mother, what is he talking about? You never mentioned anyone named Theodore Blackwood. There are a lot of things I never mentioned, Brandon, I said quietly. Apparently, I wasn't considered important enough to merit in-depth conversation about my past. The barb hit its mark. My son had the grace to look embarrassed. But I'm curious, I continued, warming to the theme, why my personal relationships are suddenly of such urgent interest to you both. 20 minutes ago, I was an embarrassment to be hidden in the back row. Now, I'm worth interrupting your reception. Vivian's carefully applied makeup couldn't quite hide the flush creeping up her neck. That's not what we just want to understand who this gentleman is and why he's here. I'm here, Theo said smoothly, because Eleanor deserves to have someone who appreciates her remarkable qualities at her son's wedding. Someone who recognizes what an extraordinary woman she is. The contrast between his words and the treatment I'd received all day was stark enough to make even Brandon shift uncomfortably. Vivian, however, rallied with the ruthless determination that had probably served her well in social climbing. Mr. Blackwood, she said with a smile that could have cut glass. I'm sure you understand that this is a family celebration. Perhaps it would be more appropriate if I what? Theo's voice remained pleasant, but there was steel underneath now. If I left and allowed you to continue treating Eleanor as an inconvenience? I don't think that's going to happen. Now, see here. Brandon began, his protective instincts finally kicking in. Though I noticed they seemed to be protecting his wife rather than his mother. No, you see here, Theo interrupted, his facade of polite interest finally dropping. I've watched for the past hour, as both of you have systematically ignored and dismissed one of the finest women I've ever known. Eleanor raised you, sacrificed for you, and loved you unconditionally. And this is how you honor her at your wedding. The words I'd longed to hear someone say hung in the air between us. Validation. Finally, from someone who mattered. You don't know what you're talking about. Vivian snapped, her composure finally cracking completely. You don't know anything about our family dynamics. Theo's laugh was cold. I know enough. I know that Eleanor was seated in the back row like an afterthought. I know that your society friends have been whispering about her all afternoon while you did nothing to defend her. And I know that neither of you bothered to ask if she needed anything or anyone today. She had an escort, Brandon protested weakly. We assumed she was bringing someone. You assumed wrong, I said quietly. But then you haven't asked me much of anything lately, have you, Brandon? The hurt in my voice must have gotten through to him, because for the first time all day, my son really looked at me. Not through me. Not past me. But at me. What he saw there made him take a step back. Mom, I didn't realize. That's exactly the problem. Theo cut him off. You didn't realize. But I did. And now I'm here. And I'm not going anywhere. That's when Vivian made her fatal mistake. Well, we'll just see about that. The threat in Vivian's voice was unmistakable, and I watched Theo's expression shift from politely amused to genuinely dangerous. Whatever my daughter-in-law thought she knew about power dynamics, she was about to receive a master class from someone who had clearly been playing this game a lot longer than she had. I'm sorry, Theo said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made smart people nervous. Are you threatening me, Mrs. Patterson? Vivian lifted her chin defiantly. I'm simply saying that if you think you can waltz into our wedding and disrupt our family, you're mistaken. We have security, and they can escort you out if necessary. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either laughter or violence. Rich and genuinely amused. Your security. He pulled out his phone and made a quick call. James? Yes, it's Theo. I'm at the Ashworth estate for a wedding. Could you send the car around? And James? Bring the portfolio. He hung up and smiled at Vivian with the patience of a cat watching a particularly foolish mouse. Security is an interesting concept, isn't it? The Ashworths have done well for themselves in Denver society. Regional wealth. Local influence. Quite impressive, really. Brandon was beginning to look like a man who sensed he was standing on quicksand, but couldn't quite figure out where the solid ground had gone. Mr. Blackwood, I think there may be some misunderstanding here. Oh, there's definitely a misunderstanding, Theo agreed. You seem to think you're in control of this situation. Let me help clarify things for you. A black Mercedes pulled up to the garden entrance, and a uniformed driver emerged, carrying a leather portfolio. He approached our group with the kind of respectful deference that money recognizes instantly. Thank you, James, Theo said, accepting the portfolio. Mrs. Patterson, Mr. Patterson, would you like to see something interesting? He opened the portfolio and pulled out what appeared to be architectural drawings. These are the plans for the new Blackwood Tower downtown. 42 stories, mixed-use development. Construction begins next month. He flipped to another page. And this is the site where it's being built. Vivian leaned forward despite herself, then went very still. That's where Ashworth Properties has their main office building. Theo corrected gently. I purchased the building last month. The current tenants have 90 days to relocate. I'm sure your father will find suitable accommodations elsewhere, though perhaps not quite as prestigious as their current location. The color drained from Vivian's face completely. Her father's real estate company was successful by Denver standards, but they were clearly minnows swimming in a pond with a shark. You can't do that, she whispered. Actually, I can. I did. The sale is already complete. Theo closed the portfolio with a soft snap. But here's the interesting part. I had no idea when I bought that building that there was any connection to this family. Pure coincidental. Brandon found his voice. What do you want? Want? Theo seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. I don't want anything from you, Brandon. You've already given me the greatest gift imaginable by treating your mother so poorly that she needed someone to sit with her today. He turned to me, and the hardness in his expression melted into something warm and real. Eleanor, would you like to leave this reception? We have 50 years to catch up on, and I find I'm no longer interested in pretending to enjoy myself here. The offer hung between us like a lifeline. I could walk away from this humiliation, from the whispered comments and social calculations. I could leave with a man who saw value in me, who had spent 5 decades trying to find me. But first, I had something to say. Brandon, I said, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. I want you to understand something. This morning, when your bride told me that my poverty would embarrass your family, I accepted it. When you seated me in the back row like some distant acquaintance, I accepted that too. I told myself that at least I was here. At least I was included. My son's face was a mask of misery, but I wasn't finished. But watching you panic because someone important is paying attention to me, seeing you scramble to figure out who Theo is and what he might want, that tells me everything I need to know about how you see me. I'm not your mother at these moments, Brandon. I'm a liability to be managed. Mom, that's not. It is exactly that, I interrupted. And the sad part is you're right. I am poor compared to Vivian's family. I did teach high school instead of building an empire. I don't wear designer clothes or belong to country clubs. By your wife's standards, I am an embarrassment. Vivian opened her mouth to protest, but I held up my hand. The difference is, I'm not ashamed of who I am anymore. I'm proud of the life I built, the students I taught, the marriage I had with your father. I'm proud of raising you to be successful, even if I'm disappointed in the man you've become. I took Theo's offered arm and felt years of accumulated hurt and resentment fall away like a discarded coat. Theodore, I said formally, I would very much like to leave this reception. I think we have some catching up to do. As we walked away from the garden, I heard Vivian's voice rise in panic behind us. Brandon, do you have any idea who Theodore Blackwood is? Do you know what this means? But I didn't look back. For the first time in 3 years, I was walking towards something, instead of away from it. The restaurant Theo chose was the kind of place I'd only read about in magazines. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Denver skyline. Soft jazz played in the background, and the waitstaff moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that discretion was more valuable than visibility. I probably should have asked, Theo said as we settled at a corner table with a view of the mountains. Are you hungry? I realized we'd both missed the wedding dinner. I laughed, surprising myself with how genuine it sounded. I don't think I could have eaten another bite of pretentious canapes. Anyway, though I have to admit, I'm curious what $500 a plate dinner tastes like. Disappointing, he said dryly. Very expensive disappointment. The waiter appeared as if summoned by telepathy. Mr. Blackwood, your usual table. Shall I bring the wine list? And could we have some of those stuffed mushrooms Eleanor likes? He caught my expression and smiled. I remember you ordered them at Romano's that night when we celebrated your acceptance to the teacher training program. The memory hit me like a physical blow. Romano's, the little Italian place that had been our special restaurant. I'd been 20 years old. He'd been 22. And we'd been so desperately in love that we could barely sit across from each other without reaching for hands. You remember what I ordered 50 years ago? I remember everything about you, he said simply. The way you laughed at your own jokes. How you got that little wrinkle between your eyebrows when you were concentrating. The fact that you always stole the olives from my salad because you were too polite to order extra for yourself. Tears pricked at my eyes. When had anyone last paid attention to me that way? Robert had loved me. I knew that. But his love had been comfortable, practical. He'd loved me the way you love a well-functioning appliance, with gratitude, but without wonder. "Tell me about your life," Theo said after the wine arrived. "Not the headlines I could find in newspaper archives. Tell me about the parts that mattered to you." So I did. I told him about my teaching career, about the students who'd kept me sane during the difficult years with Robert's illness. I told him about Brandon's childhood, about the pride I'd felt watching him graduate law school and pass the bar exam. I told him about the quiet satisfaction of a marriage that wasn't passionate but was steady and kind. And then I told him about the loneliness that had crept in after Robert's death, about feeling invisible in my own son's life, about the gradual realization that I'd become more of an obligation than a person to the people who were supposed to love me most. Today wasn't an aberration, I admitted. It was just the most public example of how things have been for months now. Brandon calls dutifully every 2 weeks, visits on holidays, and treats me like a chore to be checked off his list. I thought marriage might change that, make him more family-oriented. Instead, it's made him even more distant. Theo's jaw tightened as I talked, and by the time I finished, his expression was thunderous. "That boy doesn't deserve you. He's not a boy anymore. He's a 35-year-old man who made his choices." I sipped my wine, grateful for its warmth. "What about you? You said you never married." "No children." "No children," he confirmed. "A few relationships over the years, but nothing that stuck. I kept measuring everyone against you, which wasn't fair to them or to me." The admission hung between us, loaded with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to examine. "Theo, what are we doing here? This isn't just a friendly catch-up dinner between old flames, is it?" He set down his wine glass and looked at me with an intensity that made my breath catch. "Eleanor, I'm 70 years old. I've built a business empire, traveled the world, and accomplished everything I set out to do. But there's never been a day in the past 50 years when I didn't wonder what my life would have been like if your mother hadn't interfered." "We can't go backward," I said quietly. "We're not the same people we were at 20. "No, we're not," he agreed. "We're better. We know what we want now, what matters and what doesn't. We've lived enough life to recognize real value when we see it." The waiter appeared with our appetizers, giving me time to process what Theo was really saying. When we were alone again, he reached across the table and took my hand. "I'm not suggesting we pretend the last 50 years didn't happen. I'm suggesting we decide what we want the next 20 years to look like." My phone buzzed against my purse, then again and again. "You should probably check that," Theo said with knowing amusement. "I suspect your son has done some research since we left the reception." I pulled out my phone to find 17 missed calls from Brandon and a stream of increasingly frantic text messages. "Mom, call me immediately. Do you have any idea who Theodore Blackwood is? He's worth over $500 million. What is your relationship with him? Vivian's father wants to meet with him about the building purchase. Can you arrange an introduction? Please call. We need to talk." I showed the messages to Theo, who read them with obvious satisfaction. "Interesting how quickly their interest in your personal life developed," he observed. "What are you going to do about the building?" "Nothing. The sale is final. The contracts are signed, and Ashworth Properties has 90 days to relocate. Business is business," he paused, considering. "Though I suppose if someone convinced me that the current tenants had suddenly developed better manners and a proper appreciation for family relationships, I might be persuaded to consider a long-term lease arrangement." The implications were clear. This wasn't just about real estate. It was about power, respect, and the sudden realization that the woman they dismissed as an embarrassment was connected to someone who could significantly impact their lives. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Vivian. I looked at Theo, who nodded encouragingly. "Hello, Vivian." "Eleanor," her voice was strained, all traces of her earlier arrogance gone. "I hope you're having a pleasant evening. Brandon and I were wondering if you might be free for dinner tomorrow night. We'd love to have a proper conversation with you and Mr. Blackwood if he's available." The transformation was stunning. 12 hours ago, I'd been an embarrassment. Tonight, I was suddenly worth courting. "I'll have to check with Theodore," I said, savoring the moment. "We have quite a bit of catching up to do, as you can imagine." The silence on the other end was thick with frustration. Finally, Vivian managed, "Of course. Please let us know what works for your schedule. I hung up and looked at Theo, who was grinning like a wolf. Well, I said, raising my wine glass. This day certainly didn't go as expected. The best days never do, he replied, clinking his glass against mine. Now, shall we discuss what happens next? The dinner invitation came with an address I recognized as one of Denver's most exclusive restaurants. Apparently, when you suddenly need to impress someone with a net worth north of $500 million, you don't suggest meeting at Applebee's. Theo picked me up in his Mercedes, looking devastatingly handsome in a navy suit that probably cost more than I'd spent on clothing in the past 5 years combined. I'd chosen my best dress, a simple black number that Robert had always said made me look elegant. Tonight, with Theo's appreciative glance, I actually felt elegant for the first time in years. Nervous? He asked as we pulled up to the restaurant. Should I be? I countered. After all, I'm just having dinner with my son and the daughter-in-law who thinks I'm an embarrassment to humanity. What could go wrong? Theo's laugh was rich and warm. There's the Eleanor I remember. Sharp as a tack, and twice as dangerous when properly motivated. Brandon and Vivian were already seated when we arrived, both looking like they were attending a business negotiation rather than a family dinner, which I suppose they were. Vivian had clearly spent considerable time on her appearance tonight. Her makeup was flawless, her hair perfectly styled, and her dress screamed expensive designer. She looked like she was trying to audition for the role of worthy dinner companion. Mom, Brandon stood as we approached, his smile strained but present. Mr. Blackwood, thank you for joining us. Theodore, Theo corrected easily, extending his hand. We're practically family after all. I caught the sharp look Vivian shot her husband at that comment. Practically family? I wondered how they were interpreting that particular phrase. We were seated at a prime table with a view of the city lights, and I noticed how the staff treated Theo with the kind of deference reserved for very important people. Menus appeared without being requested. Wine was suggested and brought with remarkable speed, and the maitre d' personally ensured our table was perfect. This is lovely, Vivian said, her society smile in full force. Eleanor, you look wonderful. That dress is very flattering. I almost choked on my water. Yesterday, I'd been too poor and shabby to sit with the family. Tonight, I looked wonderful. The hypocrisy was breathtaking, even by Vivian's standards. Thank you, dear, I replied sweetly. It's amazing what good company can do for one's appearance. Theo's hand found mine under the table. A gentle squeeze of approval that sent warmth through my entire body. So, Mr. Black, Theodore. Brandon corrected himself quickly. Mom mentioned you two have a history together. She's been quite mysterious about the details. Not mysterious, I said, enjoying myself immensely. Selective. After all, children don't really want to hear about their parents' romantic past, do they? The word romantic hit the table like a small explosion. Vivian's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and Brandon looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. Romantic? Brandon repeated faintly. Oh yes, Theo said, his voice warm with memory. Your mother and I were quite serious once upon a time. We had plans, dreams, a whole future mapped out together. What happened? Vivian asked, her journalist instincts overriding her social grace. Theo's expression grew darker. Eleanor's mother happened. She decided I wasn't suitable for her daughter, despite the fact that Eleanor and I were desperately in love. When I left for London on a business program, she intercepted every letter I sent, every attempt I made to contact Eleanor. She what? Brandon's voice was sharp with shock. Grandmother intercepted your letters? I could see Brandon's legal mind working, cataloging the implications of this revelation. Every single one, I confirmed. For 2 years, Theo tried to reach me. For 2 years, I thought he'd simply moved on and forgotten about me. By the time he hired investigators to find me, I was already married to your father. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken questions. I could practically see the gears turning in both their heads, recalculating timelines, reconsidering assumptions about their family history. I loved your father, I said firmly, addressing the question I knew Brandon was afraid to ask. Robert was a good man, and we had a solid marriage, but it wasn't the same as what Theo and I had. What exactly did you have? Vivian's question came out sharper than she'd probably intended. Theo and I exchanged a look that carried 50 years of what if and might have been. Everything, he said simply. We had everything. The waiter appeared to take our orders, giving everyone a moment to process this information. When he left, Brandon leaned forward with the intensity that made him successful in the courtroom. Theodore, I need to ask directly. What are your intentions regarding my mother? If the question surprised Theo, he didn't show it. My intentions are to spend whatever time we have left making up for the years we lost. Beyond that, it depends on what Eleanor wants. All eyes turned to me. For the first time in decades, I was the center of attention. Not because I was needed for something, but because my choices mattered to other people. What I want, I said slowly, is to stop being treated like a burden or an obligation. I want to be valued for who I am, not dismissed because I don't fit someone else's idea of what's appropriate. The pointed look I gave Brandon made him shift uncomfortably in his chair. Mom, if this is about yesterday. Yesterday was just the culmination of months of being made to feel invisible, I interrupted. But we're not here to rehash the past. We're here because suddenly my personal relationships are interesting to you both. Vivian had the grace to blush, but she recovered quickly. Eleanor, I hope you understand that we were just surprised yesterday. We hadn't realized you were seeing anyone. I wasn't, I said bluntly. Theo appeared like an answer to prayers I didn't even know I was praying. And the building purchase? Brandon asked, cutting straight to the heart of their concern. Theo's smile was predatory. What about it? Vivian's father is concerned about the lease termination. His company has been in that location for 15 years. Business is business, Theo replied smoothly. Though I suppose I could be convinced to consider alternative arrangements if the circumstances were right. The negotiations were beginning in earnest now. I realized my relationship with Theo had become a commodity to be traded, a potential solution to their financial concerns. It should have made me angry. Instead, I found it fascinating. What kind of circumstances? Vivian asked eagerly. The kind that involved treating Eleanor with the respect she deserves, Theo said flatly, starting with an apology for yesterday's humiliation. The demand hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Brandon and Vivian exchanged glances, clearly weighing their options. Finally, Brandon spoke. Mom, I want you to know that I'm sorry about the seating arrangement. About not defending you when people were talking. You're right. I treated you like an obligation instead of my mother, and that was wrong. The apology sounded genuine, which made it somehow worse. If he could see how badly he treated me now, why hadn't he seen it before Theo's money made my feelings matter? And you, Vivian? I asked quietly. My daughter-in-law's struggle was visible. Pride warred with pragmatism, and pragmatism won. I apologize for my comment about your poverty, she said stiffly. It was inappropriate and hurtful. Yes, it was, I agreed. The question is, are you sorry you said it, or sorry there were consequences? She didn't answer, which was answer enough. The rest of the dinner passed in carefully polite conversation, but the real negotiation continued beneath the surface. By the time dessert arrived, the terms were clear. Treat Eleanor with respect, and Theodore might consider reasonable lease arrangements for Ashworth properties. As we prepared to leave, Vivian caught my arm. Eleanor, I hope we can start fresh. Perhaps you'd like to join us for Sunday dinner this week. 6 months ago, an invitation to Sunday dinner would have thrilled me. Tonight, it felt like another chess move in a game I was finally learning to play. I'll check my calendar, I said pleasantly. Theo and I have quite a few plans to make. The look of panic that flashed across her face was worth every moment of yesterday's humiliation. Sunday afternoon found me in Theo's penthouse apartment, which occupied the top 2 floors of one of downtown Denver's most exclusive buildings. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the mountains, and the decor was elegant without being ostentatious. This was clearly the home of someone who had money, but didn't need to prove it to anyone. Coffee? Theo offered, leading me to a sitting area that probably cost more than most people's cars. Please. I settled into a leather chair that felt like being embraced by luxury. This is beautiful, Theo. Very you, somehow. You remember what I'm like after 50 years. Some things don't change. You always had exquisite taste. Even when we were young and broke. I accepted the coffee gratefully. Though I have to admit, seeing you now, it's hard to imagine you were ever broke. Theo's laugh was rich. Trust me, there were plenty of years when I wondered if I'd made the right choices. Building a business empire is lonely work, Eleanor. Especially when the person you most wanted to share it with was living a completely different life. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of lost years settling between us. Finally, I spoke the question that had been nagging at me since yesterday. Theo, why didn't you ever try to contact me after you found out I was married? You could have at least let me know you'd been looking. His expression grew pained. I thought about it. God knows I thought about it constantly. But you seemed happy in the photos I saw. You had a husband, a child, a life. What right did I have to disrupt that with news that my love letters had been intercepted? You could have given me the choice. I could have, he agreed. But I was young and proud and hurt. I convinced myself that if you'd really loved me, you would have found a way to reach out. It took me years to understand that you probably thought the same thing about me. I set down my coffee cup with a sharp clink. We were both idiots. Spectacularly so, he agreed. Though in my defense, your mother was a formidable opponent. The woman could have given Machiavelli lessons in manipulation. The mention of my mother brought back a flood of memories I'd rather have left buried. Margaret Wilson had been a force of nature, convinced that her way was the only right way, and utterly ruthless in pursuing what she believed was best for her family. She never liked you, I said quietly. Said you were too ambitious, too focused on money and status. Ironic considering how thrilled she would have been if she could see you now. She was afraid I'd take you away from her, Theo said. And she was right. I would have. We had plans to move to California after I finished the London program. Remember? Your mother couldn't stand the thought of losing control over your life. So, she destroyed both our lives instead. Not det toy, tau ko det gen li. Redirected. You became a teacher. Touched hundreds of young lives. Raised a son. That matters, Eleanor. That has value. Does it? The question came out more bitter than I'd intended. Because right now it feels like the only thing that gives me value to my own family is my connection to you and your money. Theo reached across the space between us and took my hand. Their inability to see your worth doesn't diminish it. It just makes them blind. My phone buzzed with a text message. Brandon. Right on schedule with his weekly check-in call that had become a depressing ritual of polite small talk and barely concealed obligation. Hi Mom, just checking in. How was your week? Oh, I showed the message to Theo, who read it with obvious distaste. Every Sunday at 3 p.m., I explained, like clockwork. Duty call complete. Guilt assuaged for another week. What do you usually tell him? That I'm fine. Everything's fine. Don't worry about me. I looked at the phone, then at Theo. What do you think I should tell him today? Theo's grin was wicked. The truth? Having a wonderful weekend? Theo was showing me his art collection. We're discussing travel plans. I hit send and immediately felt a delicious thrill of rebellion. Within 30 seconds, my phone rang. Mom. Brandon's voice was tight with barely controlled panic. Travel plans. Hello, sweetheart. Yes. Theo has a house in Tuscany. We're thinking of spending a few weeks there in the fall. The silence on the other end stretched so long, I wondered if we'd been disconnected. Finally, Brandon found his voice. A few weeks in Italy? With a man you just reconnected with. Is there a problem with that? I asked innocently. Mom, you don't even have a passport. Actually, I renewed it last year. Robert and I had talked about taking a cruise before he got sick. The memory brought a pang of sadness, but it was gentle now, worn smooth by time. We never made the trip, but the passport is still valid. But Mom, you've never traveled internationally. You've barely left Colorado since Dad died. Then it's time for a change, don't you think? I could practically hear Brandon's mind racing through the implications. His mother, the woman he dismissed as a burden, was suddenly making independent plans to travel internationally with a billionaire. The power dynamics of our relationship were shifting faster than he could process. What about your house? Your responsibilities here? What responsibilities? The question came out sharper than I'd intended. Brandon, what exactly do you think I'm responsible for that would prevent me from traveling? Another long silence, because we both knew the answer. Nothing. I had no job, no dependents, no commitments that couldn't be handled with a phone call or postponed for a few weeks. My life had become so small that it could fit into a carry-on bag. I just think maybe you're moving too fast with this relationship, Brandon said finally. You've known him for what, 2 days? I've known him for 50 years, I corrected. We're just picking up where we left off. Mom, please be reasonable. You can't just run off to Italy with some man. Some man. Theo raised an eyebrow at that, clearly amused. I can't. I interrupted Brandon's protests. Why not? I'm 68 years old, Brandon. Not 8. I don't need your permission to live my life. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. You've spent the last 3 years treating me like a child who can't be trusted to make her own decisions. Well, guess what? I'm making them anyway. I hung up before he could respond and immediately turned off the phone. That felt good, I admitted to Theo. I imagine it did, though I should probably mention that I don't actually have a house in Tuscany. I stared at him for a moment, then burst into laughter. You don't? Not yet, he said with a grin. But I can have one by next week if you're interested. The casual way he said it, like buying international real estate, was no more complicated than picking up groceries, should have been intimidating. Instead, it was thrilling. Theo, I said slowly, what exactly are we doing here? We're living, he said simply. For the first time in 50 years, we're actually living instead of just existing. My phone, despite being turned off, somehow managed to ring. Theo looked at it with amusement. I think your son may have some additional thoughts to share. Let him think, I said, leaving the phone silent. His panic was just the beginning. The real consequences of my newfound independence were still to come. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor to my front door. I opened it to find a woman in her 40s with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from being born into money and privilege. Mrs. Patterson, I'm Catherine Ashworth, Vivian's mother. Of course she was. The family resemblance was unmistakable, from the calculating blue eyes to the way she held herself like someone accustomed to getting her way through sheer force of personality. Mrs. Ashworth, I said politely, not inviting her in. This is unexpected. May I come in? I think we need to have a conversation. The phrasing wasn't quite a question, more of an assumption that I would naturally comply with her wishes. It was the same tone Vivian used when she wanted something. That particular blend of entitlement and barely concealed threat that wealthy people seem to learn in the cradle. Of course, I said, stepping aside. After all, I was curious to see what the matriarch of the Ashworth family wanted badly enough to show up unannounced at my modest suburban home. She swept into my living room like she was conducting an inspection, her gaze cataloging everything from my furniture to my decorations with the kind of professional assessment that real estate agents perfected. I could practically see her calculating the value of everything in sight and finding it disappointingly low. Coffee, I offered, more from politeness than genuine hospitality. No, thank you. This shouldn't take long. She settled into my best chair like she was doing me a favor by gracing it with her presence. I'll get straight to the point, Mrs. Patterson. Your relationship with Theodore Blackwood is causing problems for my family. Is it? I settled across from her, genuinely curious about where this conversation was heading. How interesting. Don't play coy with me. Catherine snapped, her mask of politeness slipping. You know exactly what you're doing. My husband's business is being threatened because you've decided to use your friendship with Mr. Blackwood as some kind of revenge against Vivian. Revenge is such a dramatic word, I said mildly. I prefer to think of it as natural consequences. This is extortion. No, this is business. Theodore purchased a building, which is his right as a private citizen. The fact that your husband's company happens to be a tenant in that building is simply unfortunate timing. Catherine's eyes narrowed. We both know this isn't about timing. This is about Vivian's comment at the wedding. Oh, you heard about that? I asked with false surprise. How embarrassing for your family. Look, Catherine said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone playing their final card. I don't know what your game is here, but I'm prepared to make this worth your while. Now, this was interesting. Worth my while. How? She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out what appeared to be a check. $50,000. All you have to do is convince your boyfriend to honor the existing lease with Ashworth Properties. I stared at the check, genuinely shocked. Not by the amount, but by the sheer audacity of the gesture. Mrs. Ashworth, are you attempting to bribe me? I'm offering you a mutually beneficial arrangement, she corrected smoothly. You help us maintain our business relationship with Mr. Blackwood, and you receive compensation for your assistance. Compensation. I rolled the word around in my mouth like a foreign object. How much did Vivian tell you about that conversation at the wedding? Enough to know that money is a concern for you, and you assumed that meant I was for sale. Catherine's smile was razor-sharp. Mrs. Patterson, everyone is for sale. It's just a matter of finding the right price. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garden Robert and I had planted together 15 years ago. The roses were blooming beautifully this year, their crimson petals bright against the morning sun. It was a simple garden in a simple neighborhood, nothing like the elaborate landscapes I'd seen at the Ashworth estate. But it was mine, earned through 40 years of teaching and loving and building a life with a good man. You know what's funny, Mrs. Ashworth? I said without turning around. Yesterday, I might have been tempted by your offer. Not because I need the money, but because I'm so accustomed to being dismissed and undervalued that $50,000 would have felt like validation. And today, Catherine's voice had lost some of its confidence. I turned back to face her, and whatever she saw in my expression made her shift uncomfortably in her chair. Today, I know what I'm actually worth, and it's considerably more than $50,000. I walked over to where she sat and picked up the check, looking at it with the kind of detached interest I might show a museum artifact. This is insulting, Mrs. Ashworth. Not just the amount, though that's laughably inadequate. The insult is in the assumption that my relationship with Theodore is some kind of performance that can be purchased and managed. I tore the check in half, then in half again, letting the pieces flutter to the coffee table between us. My relationship with Theodore is none of your business. The lease situation is none of my business. If your husband wants to negotiate with Theodore, he's perfectly capable of picking up the phone and calling him directly. Catherine's composure cracked completely. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Patterson. The Ashworth family has considerable influence in this city. We can make things very difficult for people who cross us. Are you threatening me? I asked with genuine curiosity. I'm explaining reality. I laughed, surprising both of us with how genuine it sounded. Mrs. Ashworth, 3 days ago, your threats might have scared me. Today, they're just amusing. You see, I've spent the last 50 years being afraid of disappointing people, afraid of not being good enough, afraid of taking up too much space in the world. But yesterday, I sat in a restaurant with a man who values me for exactly who I am. A man who has spent 50 years trying to find me because he believed I was worth finding. Do you really think your social influence frightens me now? Catherine stood up abruptly, her face flushed with anger and embarrassment. This isn't over. Yes, it is, I said calmly. It's completely over. You came here to buy my compliance, and instead you've shown me exactly what kind of people you really are. Thank you for that clarity. She stormed toward the door, then stopped and turned back with one final attempt at intimidation. Your son is married to my daughter, Mrs. Patterson. That makes us family. You might want to consider what's best for Brandon's future. I've spent 35 years considering what's best for Brandon's future, I replied. It's time he started considering what's best for mine. After she left, I sat in my quiet living room and realized that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in decades, I wasn't afraid of the consequences of standing up for myself. My phone rang. Theodore's name appeared on the caller ID, and I answered with a smile in my voice. Good morning, handsome. Good morning, beautiful. How's your day starting? Interestingly, I said, looking at the torn check pieces on my coffee table. I just had the most enlightening conversation with Catherine Ashworth. Did you? How delightful. I hope you were appropriately impressed by her charm and subtlety. Deeply impressed, she offered me $50,000 to convince you to honor the lease with her husband's company. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if we'd been disconnected. 50,000? Theodore finally said, his voice carefully controlled. I told her it was insulting because the amount was too low, because the assumption was offensive. I paused, enjoying the moment. Oh, you're right. The amount was also ridiculously inadequate. Theodore's laughter was rich and warm. Eleanor, my darling, you continue to surprise me. What did you tell her? I told her that my relationship with you wasn't for sale at any price. Then I tore up her check. You tore up $50,000? It felt wonderful, I admitted. Very therapeutic. In that case, Theodore said, his voice full of mischief, I have a proposal for you. How would you like to help me send a message to the Ashworth family about the proper way to treat people they consider beneath them? What did you have in mind? Something spectacular. Something that will make $50,000 look like pocket change. The anticipation in his voice was infectious. Tell me, not over the phone. Can you meet me for lunch? I have something to show you. An hour later, I found myself in the back seat of Theodore's Mercedes, heading toward the downtown financial district. We pulled up in front of a sleek glass building that I recognized as one of Denver's most prestigious commercial addresses. Where are we going? I asked as Theodore helped me out of the car. To meet with my attorney, he said, his smile mysterious. We have some papers to sign. What kind of papers? The kind that are going to make the Ashworth family very, very sorry they ever heard the name Eleanor Patterson. As we walked into the building's marble lobby, I felt a thrill of anticipation mixed with something I hadn't experienced in years. The intoxicating sense of having real power. Whatever Theodore had planned, I was ready for it. Theodore's attorney turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s, who clearly knew her way around high-stakes financial maneuvering. Margaret Chen had the kind of precise, no-nonsense demeanor that came from years of protecting very wealthy people from very expensive mistakes. "Eleanor," Theodore said as we settled in her corner office with its commanding view of the city. "I'd like you to meet Margaret Chen, the finest attorney in Colorado and the architect of some of my more creative business ventures." "Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said, extending her hand with a professional smile. "Theodore has told me quite a lot about you. I understand you've had some interesting encounters with the Ashworth family." "That's one way to put it," I replied, settling into the leather chair across from her impressive desk. Margaret opened a thick file folder and pulled out several documents. "Theodore asked me to research the Ashworth family's business interests and financial situation. What I found is quite fascinating." She spread the papers across her desk like a dealer laying out cards. "Ashworth Properties appears successful on the surface, but they're significantly overleveraged. The building that Theodore purchased isn't just their main office location. The lease payments represent nearly 30% of their operating capital." "Meaning?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand. "Meaning they can't afford to relocate," Theodore said with satisfaction. "Not without taking a massive financial hit that would likely force them to lay off half their workforce." Margaret nodded. "The moving costs alone would run close to $2 million. And comparable space in this market would cost significantly more than their current lease rate. So, when Catherine Ashworth offered me $50,000 to convince Theodore to honor their lease," I said slowly, "she was actually trying to save her family from potential bankruptcy." "Exactly." Theodore's smile was predatory, though I suspect she didn't share that particular detail with you. I thought about Catherine's arrogant assumption that I could be bought, her threats about the family's social influence, her casual dismissal of my worth as a human being. The irony was delicious. "What are our options?" I asked, surprised by how naturally the word "our" had slipped out. Margaret pulled out another set of documents. "Well, we could simply proceed with the lease termination. Ashworth Properties would be forced to relocate, probably at significant financial cost to the family. Or," Theodore prompted, "or we could offer them alternative lease terms. Higher rate, shorter duration, with specific clauses that would give us considerable control over their business operations." I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of control?" "The kind that would require them to meet certain standards of conduct in their business dealings," Theodore said meaningfully. "Standards that would be outlined in very specific detail." The implications were staggering. Theodore wasn't just talking about a business arrangement. He was talking about holding the Ashworth family accountable for their behavior in a legally binding way. "Is that even possible?" I asked. Margaret's smile was razor-sharp. "Mrs. Patterson, you'd be amazed what people will agree to when their financial survival is at stake. Lease agreements can include all sorts of interesting clauses about tenant behavior, community involvement, charitable giving, public conduct. You want to write their humiliation into a legal contract. I want to ensure they understand that actions have consequences," Theodore corrected, "and that treating people with disrespect carries a very real cost." We spent the next hour going through the proposed lease terms. By the time Margaret finished explaining all the clauses, I was simultaneously impressed and slightly horrified by the level of control they would give Theodore over the Ashworth family's business and personal conduct. "There's one more thing," Theodore said as Margaret gathered the papers. "Eleanor, I want you to be a signatory on this lease agreement." "Me? But I'm not involved in the business side of this." "You're the injured party," he said firmly. "This whole situation exists because of how they treated you. I think it's appropriate that you have direct input into the terms of their rehabilitation." The word rehabilitation made me laugh despite myself. "You make it sound like they're criminals. Aren't they?" Theodore's voice was serious now. "They committed a crime against human decency, Eleanor. They took a woman who deserved love and respect and made her feel worthless. In my book, that's worthy of punishment." Margaret cleared her throat diplomatically. "I should mention that the Ashworth family will need to agree to these terms within 72 hours. After that, the standard lease termination proceeds automatically." "Have they been notified?" I asked. "The formal offer will be delivered this afternoon," Margaret confirmed, along with a detailed explanation of their alternatives. As we prepared to leave, Theodore took my hand. Eleanor, are you comfortable with this? I need to know that you're fully on board before we proceed. I thought about Catherine Ashworth's attempt to buy my compliance. I thought about Vivian's casual cruelty at the wedding, her assumption that my poverty made me unworthy of basic respect. I thought about years of being dismissed and undervalued, of being treated like an obligation rather than a person. I'm more than comfortable, I said firmly. I'm excited, kropka. That evening, my phone started ringing at precisely 6 p.m. Brandon. Right on schedule, though his usual weekly check-in had been moved up by 24 hours. Mom, what the hell is going on? Good evening to you too, sweetheart, I said pleasantly. I'm fine. Thank you for asking. Don't play games with me. Vivian's mother just called her in tears. Something about lease agreements and impossible demands and financial ruin. What did you do? I didn't do anything, I said truthfully. Theodore made a business decision based on standard market practices. Standard market practices don't include forcing tenants to make public apologies as part of their lease agreements. Oh, so they'd had time to read the fine print. Is that what the contract says? How interesting. Mom, you can't be serious about this. You're talking about destroying an entire family's livelihood over a wedding seating arrangement. Am I? I thought I was simply ensuring that certain standards of human decency were maintained in business relationships. This is extortion. No, Brandon. This is consequences. There's a difference, though I understand why you might not recognize it. The silence on the other end of the line was thick with frustration. Finally, Brandon spoke again, his voice carefully controlled. What do you want, Mom? What will it take to make this go away? The question hung between us like a challenge. What did I want? For 50 years, I'd wanted to be valued, respected, treated like a person whose feelings mattered. For 3 years since Robert's death, I'd wanted my son to see me as more than an obligation to be managed. I want, I said slowly, for your wife to understand that treating people like dirt has consequences. I want her family to learn that money and social position don't give them the right to humiliate others. And I want you to decide whether you're on their side or mine. Mom, that's not fair. Fair. The word came out harsher than I'd intended. Brandon, when has anything about the last 3 years been fair to me? When was it fair that you seated me in the back row at your wedding like some distant acquaintance? When was it fair that your wife called me a poverty-stricken embarrassment to your family? She apologized for that. She apologized because Theodore has money and power. Where was her apology before that? Where was yours? Another long silence. When Brandon spoke again, his voice was smaller, more uncertain. What do you want me to do? I want you to choose, I said quietly. Vivian's family has 72 hours to accept Theodore's lease terms or find new office space. During those 72 hours, you can stand with the family that humiliated your mother, or you can stand with the mother who loves you despite everything. Mom, I'm done talking, Brandon. The next conversation we have will tell me everything I need to know about what kind of man I raised. I hung up and immediately turned off my phone. And for the first time in 3 years, I was calling the shots in my own family. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Now I had to wait to see if my son would choose love or social status. Something told me the answer would define the rest of our relationship. The call came at exactly 5 p.m. on Wednesday, 71 hours and 15 minutes after Margaret Chin had delivered the lease terms to Ashworth Properties. I was in Theodore's penthouse, ostensibly helping him choose artwork for the Tuscany house he'd purchased that morning, when his phone rang. Theodore Blackwood, he answered, putting the call on speaker so I could hear. Mr. Blackwood, this is Richard Ashworth. I believe you're expecting my call. The voice was carefully controlled, but I could hear the strain underneath. This was a man who had spent the last 3 days coming to terms with financial reality. Mr. Ashworth, I trust you've had time to review our proposal thoroughly. We have, and we, my family, would like to accept your terms. The admission clearly cost him. I watched Theodore's face remain impassive, though I caught the slight tightening around his eyes that meant he was pleased. All of them? Theodore asked. Including the public conduct clauses and the community service requirements? All of them. And the personal apologies? A longer pause. Yes, though I'd like to discuss the timing and format. The terms are non-negotiable, Mr. Ashworth. Your daughter-in-law's public apology to Mrs. Patterson will be delivered exactly as specified, or the lease termination proceeds as originally planned. I had to admire Theodore's negotiating style. There was no gloating, no unnecessary cruelty, just the implacable certainty of someone who held all the cards and knew it. I understand. When do you need the first apology delivered? This Friday. The charity luncheon at the country club seems like an appropriate venue, don't you think? Mrs. Patterson will be attending as my guest. My eyebrows shot up. This was the first I'd heard about attending any charity luncheon, though the symmetry was perfect. The same social circle that had witnessed my humiliation at the wedding would now witness Vivian's public acknowledgement of her behavior. We'll be there, Richard Ashworth said heavily. Excellent. Margaret Chin will send over the final contracts tomorrow morning. Welcome to your new lease arrangement, Mr. Ashworth. Theodore hung up and turned to me with a smile that was part satisfaction, part concern. Are you ready for this? He asked. Once that apology is delivered publicly, there's no going back. Your relationship with Brandon and Vivian will be permanently changed. I thought about that. For 3 years, I'd been tiptoeing around my son's marriage, accepting scraps of attention, and swallowing countless small humiliations in the hope of maintaining family harmony. The relationship was already broken. I was just finally acknowledging it. Good, I said firmly. It needed to be changed. Friday arrived with unseasonable warmth and brilliant sunshine, as if the universe was conspiring to make this day as memorable as possible. Theodore had arranged for me to have my hair and makeup done professionally, and I'd chosen a dress that struck the perfect balance between elegant and understated. I wanted to look like someone worth apologizing to. The country club was buzzing with Denver's social elite. All of them ostensibly there to support the Children's Hospital charity, but mostly there to see and be seen. I recognized several faces from the wedding, including some of the women who had whispered about my background while I sat alone in the back row. Mrs. Patterson. A familiar voice called out as we made our way across the dining room. How lovely to see you again. It was one of Vivian's society friends, the same woman who had been whispering about my former career as a house cleaner. Now she was beaming at me like we were old friends, clearly having reassessed my social value since learning about my connection to Theodore. How nice, I murmured, accepting her air kisses with amusement. I'm surprised you remember me. Of course I remember. You looked so elegant at the wedding. And Mr. Blackwood, what a pleasure to meet you properly. The transformation was fascinating to watch. These people who had dismissed me as unworthy of acknowledgement were now treating me like visiting royalty. Their entire attitude shifted by the simple presence of Theodore's money and influence. We took our seats at a prime table near the front of the room, and I noticed how conversations quieted as people realized who I was. The whispers were different now, speculative rather than dismissive, curious rather than cruel. The luncheon proceeded with the usual charity event rituals. Speeches about the worthy cause, updates on fundraising goals, recognition of major donors. I noticed that the Ashworth family was seated at a table in the middle of the room, close enough to be visible, but far enough away to avoid accidental conversation. Vivian looked beautiful as always, but there was a brittleness to her composure that hadn't been there at the wedding. She kept glancing in our direction, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Finally, the moment arrived. The event coordinator announced that Mrs. Vivian Patterson had requested a few minutes to address the gathering. The room grew quiet as Vivian made her way to the podium, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor with the precise rhythm of someone maintaining control through sheer willpower. She looked out over the crowd, her gaze finding mine and holding it for a long moment. Thank you all for your attention, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the room's sound system. I wanted to take this opportunity to address something important in front of this community that means so much to my family. She paused, and I could see her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the podium. Last week at my wedding, I said something thoughtless and cruel to my mother-in-law, Eleanor Patterson. I told her that her poverty would embarrass our family, and I treated her with a level of disrespect that was completely unacceptable. The room was absolutely silent now, everyone hanging on her words. This kind of public admission of wrongdoing was unprecedented in their social circle. I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. Eleanor Patterson is a woman who dedicated her life to educating young people, who raised a successful son, and who deserves respect and admiration, not the treatment I gave her. Vivian's voice cracked slightly on the next words. I let my own insecurities and prejudices cloud my judgment, and I hurt someone who should have been welcomed into our family with love and gratitude. Eleanor, I am deeply, genuinely sorry for my behavior, and I hope that someday you can forgive me. She stepped away from the podium to scattered, uncertain applause. The crowd was clearly unsure how to react to such an unprecedented public confession. I stood up slowly, aware that every eye in the room was on me. This was my moment. I could accept the apology graciously and let everyone move on, or I could make it clear that some wounds couldn't be healed with a simple sorry. "Thank you, Vivian," I said, my voice carrying clearly in the hushed room. "Your apology is noted and appreciated." The words were polite, correct, and utterly without warmth. Everyone in the room understood that forgiveness had not been granted, merely acknowledged. As we left the luncheon, Theodore took my arm. "How do you feel?" "Free," I said, surprising myself with how true it was. For the first time in years, I feel completely free. My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. "Mom, can we talk?" I looked at the message, then at Theodore, then back at the phone. Whatever my son wanted to say, I was finally ready to hear it from a position of strength, rather than desperation. "Tomorrow," I texted back. "Your move." For 50 years, I'd been reacting to other people's choices, accepting other people's definitions of my worth, living other people's versions of my story. At 68 years old, I was finally ready to write my own ending, and it was going to be spectacular. Let me know all your thoughts in the comments below. I truly can't wait to read them. If this story gave you that boost of strength, please hit the like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience and unexpected turns. And don't forget to share this with someone who needs to hear that it's never too late to reclaim your worth. Thanks for watching. Take care. Good luck.